Resolute Square.
There was also maintained what was called an enemies list, which is rather extensive and continually being updated.
Democrats want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
I'm Rick Wilson, and this is The Enemies List.
My guest today is Kimberly Atkins Stohr, who is the senior opinion writer and columnist for the Boston Globe opinion section. And you've also seen her on MSNBC. She hosts the Politicon podcast called SisterInLaw and is also a guest host on WBUR's On Point. So, Kimberly, thank you so much for coming on the Enemies List today. I wanted to just catch up because, you know, it's been a pretty slow news week, as you can imagine. And I wanted to just get your perspective a little bit on how the news and the media is handling this incredibly consequential moment we're having with the Trump indictments and this looming national political crisis that is wrapped up in it.
Yeah, I think a lot of us do the best that we can with a lot of information that is coming out quickly that can be confusing, but that is also incredibly important. I mean, you mentioned the podcast, hashtag SisterInLaw. That came together just because I and the other three co-hosts, Barb McQuaid, Joyce Vance, and Jill Wine-Banks, we would talk to each other, you know, just to try to parse what was going on and what it might mean. And we thought those conversations would be helpful to be public, just so that other people can help understand from the perspective of four people with a legal background and a political background. Just to put it together. And one gratifying thing about that is that we hear from our listeners that we make it make sense. And it's disheartening to see some reporting that since the first indictments dropped, that now it's reaching a point where it seems to be noise to a lot of listeners, a lot of audience members, a lot of voters. They're not exactly sure what it all is. It's all conflated. They don't know what it all means. And so I think that the media needs to do a better job of focusing on what's important, explaining what it means and what it doesn't, and trying to filter out the noise, as difficult as that job might be.
You know, I think that's a really good point. That as a culture, as a country right now, I think there's so much stuff in the zone all the time. There's so many things coming at people from so many different directions. And these cases are like complex multivariate problems. These are not, did the guy run a red light? It's much more in-depth than that. Is that something that journalism in this country has sort of let its muscles atrophy on a little bit? Because I feel like we've done a lot of horse race stuff for the last, and a lot of what crazy thing did Trump say today for the last 8 years. I mean, do you think that our national media, that the press is ready to scale into digging into a story like this that is so consequential and so complicated?
I hope so, and they should be. I agree that there is a tendency, and there continues to be a tendency, much to my chagrin, honestly, to treat the politics of this and everything, especially leading up to a presidential election, like the normal horse race style. And I've decided, at least for myself, that I'm not going to simply do that, even when I am on, whether it's in the Globe or on MSNBC or anywhere else that I may appear, while I am talking about polls and the hold that Donald Trump seems to have on the Republican Party and what may happen in the primary or in the general, I also underscore the fact that what he's accused of isn't just a crime, it's undermining democracy. And that this is, we always say this every time, right? But this time it's for real. It's the most consequential election of our lifetime, because it's very likely that the accountability for that may not come through the courts, or at least not in time. It may have to be delivered by voters. And I think we need to be clear to the voters who are willing to listen just what the stakes are, and not just treat this as a, who's up, who's down. Is it DeSantis? Is it Trump? I mean, that's not the reality that we're living in right now.
Yeah, I think you're right, though. There is a huge temptation to let the horse race thing, and as I sort of facetiously say lately, guys, you can't make a horse race out of horse manure. This guy's, we've got to recognize he's sort of this sort of gigantic singularity in our politics where everything is drawn into what does this mean because, of his dominant role inside the party, his dominant role in this large criminal conspiracy that January 6th seems like a long time ago, but January 6th was the end point of a period of time in that 3-month window from election day to January 6th, or 2-month window, that there was an active attempt to overthrow an American election. Do you think people, even in journalism, sometimes I feel like there's this that was that thing that happened, and not a recognition of how consequential and how, if this had gone the other way, if they had succeeded on January 6th, we'd be in a very different country right now, right? Just a fundamentally different country.
We really would. Journalists are not historians, we are looking at what is happening in real time. We were all brought up on if it bleeds, it leads. It's all about the newest thing that's happening and what might happen next. And so in a way, the media is uniquely unprepared or is inadequate to handle what's happening in that way, because context is often lost, and particularly now, with social media and very, fractionized media sources. But I think we have to do a better job of being that first draft of history and talk to people who have an understanding of this. The column that I wrote last week, I talked to people who studied the fall of democracies around the world, and made it clear that all of the elements, the disinformation, the fomenting distrust in our institutions, in demonizing the opposite side, anybody who is against you as not just an enemy of you, but of America. These are the things, these are the ways that democracies that seem just as strong as America's have fallen across the globe, and that there is a real risk of that. I know that sounds alarmist to say in a way, but it's not. And I think that there needs to be a clearer eye on that. We can't just rely on those experts, and hope that they get some airtime on TV because they're not as exciting to explain that.
Right.
But I think that needs to be a part of the context of all of this. I think the more of that there is, the better. I know we do our best, Rick, but there needs to be more.
I read the piece, and last week I interviewed Barbara Walter, who wrote the book How Civil War Start, and it did strike me again. There's a profound normalcy bias in our country, not only with the media, but with people. People would love for us to go back to being a country where we were like fighting about marginal tax rates or any of these other things that used to sort of define a hot political crisis. Now it's does the country survive? Does a representative democracy survive? Does the American Republic make it? And I do think there's a drumbeat on the far right now saying this is a civil war. If you go after Trump, it's a civil war. It's a civil war, and that is one of those things. As your article points out, as we silo out into different separate media silos, as distrust becomes like the coin of the realm for all of our interactions politically, as people segregate themselves into red states and blue states and red cities and blue or red country and blue cities, and this division keeps going on and on and on. I feel like we have to challenge the normalcy bias. We have to challenge the idea that things are always going to work out somehow, that America is going to have this sort of like providential bailout of bad political climate that we've always survived in the past doesn't mean we're always going to survive in the future.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. First things first, right? Democracy is not a self-fulfilling concept. It's something that needs to be protected. It needs to be actively protected. So if you want to talk about tax rates, if you want to talk about small government, if you want to talk about the debt limit and all that kind of stuff, first and foremost, you have to protect democracy. None of those things still exist. The ability to have these policy differences won't matter anymore if you don't have the democracy underneath it. One thing that I think is just problematic is that there is not a single leader. There's not a voice that has captured even the center part of our nation, the voice of reason that people can listen to, that people can, be inspired by, or that people respect. There was a time that even, someone from a different political party, when they spoke, you would listen, right? I have never been a registered Republican. I'm not registered in either party at the moment, but I've never been a registered Republican. But after 9/11, did I listen to George W. Bush? Of course I did.
Sure.
And did he act like a leader? Of course he did. We don't have that anymore. And I think that's one reason why we don't have that clear clarion call about what the stakes are. And that's a big problem.
When I worked for for Bush 41, I mean, he respected the opinions of people like Senator Sam Nunn from Georgia and Les Aspin. They may disagree on some of the details, but they worked across the aisle on a lot of different things. As the end of the Cold War was happening, that was something that did require a bipartisan solution. And today we end up with these things that are a little bipartisan on the edges, but they're not. But especially on the Republican side of the equation, it's like, yeah, they all want the things out of the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. None of them want to show up at the press conference or have their name on the billboard outside because they're afraid of their own partisans on their right flank will say, "How dare you work with Joe Biden and the communists," or whatever fantasy they have in their head that day about what the purpose of working together is. And I do think that's right. I think that it's hard to find people who are, today's version of a John McCain or a Sam Nunn or, stretching even further back, like a Scoop Jackson or people that, you could say there, I have a difference or two with so-and-so, but I believe, even though he's in the other party, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, that person believes in the good of America. That person believes that we should be working together to keep, no matter what our differences is, we're all going to stand, shoulder to shoulder for the country. And unfortunately, I think, January 6th showed us that that's not necessarily like a center tenet of the Republican Party anymore.
No, there were glimpses of it after January 6th. A couple of Republicans for a moment demonstrated that, but we don't have the person that is standing on the proverbial pile of rubble in downtown New York City, speaking through the megaphone. We don't have that. We don't have even in the early Obama era, because I believe the division sort of started in the middle of that from the backlash to Obama's election. But I remember after that election, I was in an office building of somebody, in an elevator with somebody who I knew was a Republican operative. After Obama gave his speech in Chicago, accepting the result of it, and said to me, I worked against this guy getting elected, but this is a really cool moment for our country. We are bereft of that right now. And I think that's one reason that we are here.
And I think unfortunately a lot of Democrats have now reached the point where they've reached across the aisle and have their hands bitten enough times to know that that in the current incarnation of the GOP, you're just not going to get very many opportunities. I mean, you see once in a blue moon, a little bit here and there in the Senate side, but in the House, it's just like open warfare. Which I think look, and I'm not saying the Democrats are completely innocent of this and they haven't played the same kind of ball game, but there is a difference. I think that's fundamental right now is that the Democrats have an approach to governance and the Republicans have an approach to power. And it seems to me that right now we're looking at a one party that is obsessed with power and control and using the power of the state against people. And Democrats are still trying to approach it. Whether you agree with them or not, it's more programmatic and policy driven and philosophically driven than the retention of power and the application thereof.
I think that that's a really good way to say it. I think in my latest column, I stated as the attack on democracy is coming from one party and the other party is just failing to do enough about it. And this is where we stand, and that is unsustainable. But I think that is it. I mean, even before the attempted coup, I was talking to Democrats about the Supreme Court, back in 2016, before that election, saying, well, how Merrick Garland is on ice. Like, what are you going to do? And they talk about, the importance of the rule of law,
tradition, civility,
tradition and respect of the. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Republicans are over there campaigning on the SCOTUS, taking it back. They have a plan. What's your plan? There was no plan. It was all about, these theoretical ideas and about what the judiciary should be, and I was really frustrated by that. As we're voters, I'm sure, and that's how we got to where we are. No,
I think you're exactly right. I mean, I had a conversation with a guy right after Dobbs happened, and he said, "I can't believe, Planned Parenthood failed so bad." I'm like, this should not have come as a surprise to you. They told you for 50. And I was never a social conservative, right? That was never my lane in the party. Right. But I'm like, these people told you for 50 years almost what they were going to do. They told you exactly step by step how they were going to do it. And the last step was to find the right window in the Supreme Court and replace as many justices in as quick a time as they could and race these cases through the lower courts. And so it's
That's exactly what they did.
Don't be surprised when bad people do the bad things that you've been, that you pretend that gentlemen won't do. I mean, it's like the old in World War I. We started spying on the Germans, and the one of the people at the State Department was like, "Gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail." Well, when the other country's at war with you, you do read the other gentlemen's mail. You do treat them a little differently. What do you think the Democrats if you could influence how they think about this moment, about how they not just politically, but how they communicate about their objectives, what would you encourage them to do?
I would encourage them to be more fearless. I mean, at this point, I am tired of arguments about, well, if we make this move or we try to pass this reform, then they're going to use it against us once they take, they're going to do that anyway.
Right.
Like, you can't be worried about that. Right. You need to focus on doing what is right. Focus on doing what is just, even if it is not what you thought before we were in this crisis was politically expedient or could backfire on you. Everything has already backfired. There is no more room left for it to backfire. Act boldly, protect voting rights, protect election work. I mean, read these indictments and see all of the things that went wrong. The attempts to influence election workers. The Ruby Freemans and Shay Mosses of our country. Yeah. In ways to try to influence and threaten. I'm really tired of hearing how Trump asked for 11,000 and some odd. No, he threatened. We heard that call. He threatened Brad Raffensperger with being charged criminally if he did not join in this conspiracy. He coerced and threatened him. We need to protect against that. We need to stop the kind of gerrymandering that sort of made this unequal minority rule that has enabled this. We have to strengthen the pillars of our democracy. We have to fix the impeachment power, because we could have avoided all of this if we had a strong impeachment power. Yep. So that's what if Democrats are, by and large, with the exception of the few, the only folks right now that are focused on this, they need to do it, and they need to make clear to the American people what they're doing and why.
I think that's a really good point, is that being fearless about this stuff, being fearless in the defense of democracy. I mean, that to me, it's the right moral thing to do. It's the right political thing to do. And it's the right thing as a patriot to do. Is, again, like you said, this is not going to, the democracy doesn't like run itself. It requires people to do the work every single generation, every single time. It doesn't just skate down a path forever and ever, without investment and effort. And to a great degree, you're right. You look at the Trump case, and I'm not a lawyer, but I read the indictments, and this thing was so broad and systematic, and ranged from the most like boring legal maneuvers to, again, the threats against people like Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, which to my mind, I am looking for the comeuppance for my old boss Rudy Giuliani and the rest of those people that threaten them at a level I can hardly tell you, because they represent the kind of people, thousands and thousands and thousands of folks who go out and do the election work. That's democracy. That's like hands-on democracy. And to be called cheaters and have their lives threatened, and to live in fear and to have to move and all that. It's just, it is an outrage that's personalized in this, but so much of this, I think Democrats often underestimate just how much Republicans love a plan, and that they'll go at every single axis of a problem until they find a way to get into it. And then they'll just drive as hard as they can.
Yep. And right now, part of the Republican message coming from Donald Trump on down is that he's being attacked politically, because what is really happening is an attack on Americans. He's saying they're coming after me, but what they're really doing is coming after you. What these indictments charge, particularly, both of them, but particularly in plain language, the Jack Smith indictment says this was an attack on voters' ability to vote and have their votes counted. This was an attack on all of you. So that's what Democrats write up to Joe Biden. Listen, I know Joe Biden wants to keep his hands off this, and he doesn't, but he's also the candidate. He's also the candidate tasked with defeating Trump politically. Yeah. And I think the core of his campaign should be protecting the rights of all Americans, regardless of party, regardless of where you live. They were all imperiled by what happened on the other side. And you need to protect that. And that's what I and all the other Democrats here are trying to do, and what Donald Trump and his acolytes are trying to do is take your power away to bolster their own. I think that's a clear, easy message. That's as easy as build the wall. And that's what Democrats should come up with.
Yeah, I think that's true. And look, Joe Biden in 2022, when he finally said the word, I mean, in the beginning of 2022 and late 21, I talked to a lot of Democratic activists and donors, and they were like, oh, this election is going to be about fighting inflation and gas prices and food costs. And I was like, are you out of your mind? It's been a year since they invaded the Capitol. This election is going to be about democracy. And when the president came out and said this election is about democracy, I think it framed the race for a lot of Americans in 2022. And I agree with you. I think he needs to be out there at some point and say, I'm not going to comment on the case itself. That I'm not going to comment on the details because I have nothing to do with that. But I will say the actions that are described in this case are a challenge to America. And if you folks aren't paying attention to what they did then, they're going to do it again. And I think he could make a lot of mileage on that without overstepping the bounds of communicating, to the DOJ some intentionality. But what the White House misses here is the Republicans are going to accuse Joe Biden, they already are, of running the entire program and saying, oh, this is just to beat Trump. We all know that's BS. We know that's a lie, but it's the kind of lie the Republicans are very good at getting their base to believe.
Well, let me ask you this, Rick. Let me ask you a question, turn the tables a little bit. Do you think that there are enough good conservatives who understand very well what the stakes are. Because, I mean, one reason that I think Joe Biden was elected is that a lot of people believed that he would try, at least, whether he would be successful or not, to work in a bipartisan way. And that's what he did in the Senate. That's part of his brand.
Sure, still is.
Do you think there are enough
I think
Republicans who can stand up and speak clearly about this threat? Because that's necessary too.
Sure. It's a great question. And I think the answer is yes. I think there's a coalition out there of Republicans that in 2020, when we looked at it, depending on the state, they model between like 3 to 8% of the Republican population. Post January 6th and post Dobbs, that number has grown between 7 and 11% in our models, at least. And so I think there's a large portion of that group that do believe in democracy, that are not comfortable with the mob rule idea, that will walk away from it. It's not going to be easy to hold all of them, but that's the work of persuasion, where folks who are basically like me and a lot of my associates, we look at Trump or his clones like DeSantis as not as a return to Republican power, but as a branching off into an authoritarian darkness for this country that nobody of good faith or patriotism can accept. So I think there are enough of them out there. They're part of a broader coalition. There are a lot of Republican women who were always soft, on the abortion issue. They were either somewhat mildly or quite pro-choice. And that's about 22 to 25% of the Republican female vote. Those folks, they're going to vote on choice, and they're not going to vote for Trump again. They are very upset. We saw that play out in Kansas, Wisconsin, and Ohio this last week. And we're seeing changes on the ground in places like Texas and Florida, even on the abortion question, because Republicans have taken it way off the cliff. The dog caught the car, as everyone jokes. So I think there's a big coalition out there, and I'm optimistic about it. Obviously, I wouldn't do the work I do, aside from this, without a sense of optimism about being able to capture Republicans and conservative-leaning independents and help them, navigate this country out of what Trump is promising in his second term, which is vengeance, authoritarianism, a crazier and crazier embrace of the culture wars and all that.
Yeah, I hope you're right.
I better be. Well, we're a country, like I said earlier, we've been very providential. We've been very lucky a lot of the times that we face these things. And I'm hoping through like hard work and good work, we're going to end up with another good outcome. Well, I want to thank you so much, Kimberly Stohr, for joining us today on The Enemies List. It was a great conversation. I look forward to having you back again soon. Tell folks where they can find your writing and where they can find you on social media.
Yes, so you can find me in the pages of the Boston Globe or bostonglobe.com. You can listen to #SistersInLaw wherever you get your podcast, including where you get this one. And my handles on, what is it? X. And also Threads is Kimberly E. Atkins.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for joining us, Kimberly. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Well, joining us again on the Enemies List this week, the Republicans in the House of Representatives. I know you're thinking, oh my God, why isn't Trump and the indictments and all the craziness around that? It's really not. Because I want you folks to remember that in the coming weeks and months, you're going to see an unbelievable ramp up of all this bullshit from Jim Comer and Kevin McCarthy and Elise Stefanik, the Gretchen Wieners of Congress, and Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Three Toes and all the rest of the crazies and the kooks and the loonies. They're all going to be out there trying to make the world into, it's Hunter Biden's laptop and Hunter corruption and this. And they're going to be trying to impeach Joe Biden, and they're going to try to impeach Vice President Harris, and all the madness that's going to go on in the House. Once again, Kevin McCarthy, you are approaching another debt ceiling fight. You're going to go ahead and you're going to take us to the cliff again. You're going to hurt American markets again. For God's sakes, Kevin, have like the smallest microscopic shred of dignity and decency and lead your own caucus. Actually do some things for the people in this country, because right now the lunatics are in charge of the asylum. And the more you put Comer and Jordan and the rest of these morons out in front, the less chance you have of of having even the slightest scintilla of success with the American people in governing. And I know that doesn't matter to you on one hand. You've got your portrait now that you're going to be, you've been the speaker, great. But your own people are going to lose seats in this election, in part because you're letting them chase down the stupidity rabbit hole of Jim Comer and Jim Jordan and all this fake impeachment crap. So Kevin, once again, you're on the enemies list. Thanks again for listening to The Enemies List. If you have any comments, questions, or if there's someone you'd like to hear on the podcast, hit me up on Twitter at @TheRickWilson. Thanks again for the wonderful support you've shown the pod. We're growing fast. It really helps if you will share this with your friends, your family, and anyone else who, like us, is trying to save democracy. While you're at it, if you could rate and review the podcast, I would be very much appreciative. I know this is the sort of thing you've heard a billion times. Please rate, review, like, blah, blah, blah. But you need to do it. It really does help us a lot. We are slaves to the algorithm, my friends, and if you do this, it will help get the pod out further. Anyway, thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time. And remember, whatever you do, stay off the list.